Okay, in this video, I want to talk about Stephen's 5 arguments for vegetarianism, and his contention that these 5 arguments put together would make a virtuous person inclined to adopt vegetarianism or veganism. And then I'm going to also present maybe not a counter argument, but definitely a nuanced argument that shifts these responsibilities of a virtuous person, or so I would believe. And so I'll present my argument, and then we're gonna go through the arguments to figure out how my argument and his arguments reconcile with each other and where those sit together. Stevens claims that his arguments would make a virtuous person adopt vegetarianism. And so I'm going to come at it from what is a virtuous person. And the dictionary or accepted universal definition of a virtuous person, a person that follows virtues, would be somebody that subscribes to an ethic, a set of moral rules that they attempt to regulate their life in accordance with. So somebody that has a philosopher that they very much believe created the ultimate philosophy that they should be following for their life might do that. Within virtue ethics, there's a subsect which is Kantian virtues. And so say someone were a strict Kantian. In his categorical imperative, it doesn't say anything about not eating animals. So by that standard, they might decide that they can eat animals and still be a virtuous person because they're still subscribed to an ethic that they are living their life by. And the same could be said for a religious person. If somebody had a specific religious commitment that made them subscribe to a specific belief system, that would change the way that they perceive Stephen's arguments for vegetarianism. And so my argument here is that virtue is subjective, and as long as you're subscribing to an ethic, it might not be Stephen's ethic, but as long as you're putting in calculated thought and attempting to make the most ethical decision, you are still a virtuous person and may not be persuaded by Stephen's arguments. Okay, so given that I've created this character of a virtuous person who subscribes to a specific ethic, let's go through Stephen's arguments and figure out how a virtuous person subscribing to the dominant worldview would take these arguments and where they would lie within these arguments. So for the argument from distributional justice, his argument is basically that it takes a 20-to-1 ratio of grain to meat to produce 1 pound of beef. So it takes 20 pounds for 1 pound of beef, and then it takes 10 for pork and 6 for turkey. And so what he's trying to establish here is that it takes a significant amount more grain and soy that goes to create a significant amount less meat. And so then he says there are people in places in this world that do not have even a minimal amount of access to grain and soy to substantiate a healthy diet. And so his argument from distributional justice is that if you're one of these affluent people that has the option to eat meat and to engage in that wasteful system, you should take the option not to do that out of solidarity for people that don't have enough food, even basic grain and soy amount of food. And in the critical discussion, he attempts to disprove what I'm about to try to prove, in that he says that even though he is aware that just because somebody doesn't eat chicken in the US, that doesn't mean that grain is appearing on someone else's plate in a third world country. But he does say that because causal lines can't be established as non-existent, they are enough to implore somebody to exclude themselves from that wasteful industry. Excuse me, I'm sorry. But yeah, and so what I would say is that I don't think that you can establish causal lines, especially given the lack of actual ability for us to affect the meat industry via supply and demand, because the meat industry and the grain and soy industry that feeds into the meat industry are all subsidized by the government. So those are outside of the circles of supply and demand. And so us boycotting doesn't actually make less meat be produced or less grain and soy be put into meat farming. It actually might mean that we're wasting more food, because that meat was produced and it was sold and went down the line, and then it was in a grocery store, and because all of these people in this specific area have decided that they are persuaded by Stevens, they might not buy the meat, and then the meat might go bad. Nobody ate it before it went bad. And so then actually that's that many grains plus that pound of meat that went bad because someone tried to be virtuous by claiming solidarity with a group of people that they're not actively affecting necessarily. So yeah, that's my contention with that one. And then we move down to the argument from environmental harm, which is the argument that the factory farming industry, the industrial farming industry, is having immense and negative side effects on the ecological systems and the earth as a whole. And I'd say, yep, that's true. And I think that a lot of people, even if they're subscribing to a dominant worldview or an ethic that promotes anthropocentrism, would also say, yeah, that's true. But that might not mean that they fully decide to boycott meat. It might actually mean that we're gonna only eat meat that's locally raised and processed and that was grass-fed, and maybe grass-fed for beef and like free range for chicken, and to make more conscious, sustainable choices rather than just to fully say no to meat. And I have a reductio to read out. Burning fossil fuel to produce electricity is the largest detriment to the environment through the emission of carbon dioxide. It is virtuous to do at least what you can to try to protect the environment. So using the logic of boycotting meat because it is environmentally detrimental, you should boycott electricity because it's environmentally detrimental. Or airlines. Airlines are a huge polluter. If it's your virtuous act to refrain from polluting as much as possible, you should never fly. But these are not actually legitimate things that everyone has the access to do. And so it might actually just mean make the most sustainable choice that you can. And so then we move down to the argument from sexual politics, and the argument from sexual politics assimilates patriarchy and meat eating through the traced historical logic of meat-eating society and the subjugation of women. The feminist argument from sexual politics displays the fact that because the animals are thought of as merely vessels intended for a specific use, in this case being consumption, in these societies women are also thought of as only vessels for consumption in another way. And so this urges feminists to boycott meat because it is a tool for their subjugation in the dominant patriarchy. Which they use a lot of examples of women being served meat last because meat is more for men, and men require meat more than women, which is not true, but but that's the dominant view in this situation. And so it uses all of these examples where they'll go around the circle or clockwise, and all of the men will get meat first, and then the women won't get any meat. And then the logic that comes out of that, and what Stevens implores people to do, is then boycott the meat industry. But you could also flip that on its head and say, well, if women have historically been served less meat, if they've been served meat last, if they've been deprived of this thing that is perceived as good, and more worth giving to a more worthy person, then maybe feminists should be eating more meat, and reclaiming the eating of meat. So I don't know that that's really a perfect example. And then we go down to the argument for moral consideration of animals. In Singer's case, we are all sentient beings. The interest of every sentient being ought to be taken account and given the same weight. And I feel like this is where people coming in from the Kantian perspective or a religious perspective that promotes anthropocentrism would immediately take fault with that and say, actually, no, humans deserve to be given more weight than animals. And I have constructed a reductio for this one as well. Excuse me, I'm going to read that out loud so that I don't mess it up. If all beings with inherent value have equal inherent value, then, that's for the inherent value. But either way, if you have an anthropocentric view, you're going to say, no, I don't believe Singer's appeal. And then for Reagan's inherent value appeal, here's a reductio that I've constructed. It's, if all beings with inherent value have equal inherent value, then the inherent value of a human is the same as a chicken. So if you saw a chicken about to wander off the edge of a cliff, and you saw a human about to wander off the edge of a cliff, and you had the ability to save one of them, you would have no moral imperative to save the human over the chicken, in Reagan's view. And so that's where I come into problem with that. And then the prudential argument from health, he says basically that it's been historically proven that indigenous societies that didn't eat as much meat were the healthiest societies that lived the longest, that it's been proven now that eating a balanced vegetarian diet is healthier than eating a diet with meat. And so I'd like to say, and come at it from the perspective of this person, and say that maybe you decide to cut meat out of your diet, and then you only really have access based on your class situation, based on your time situation, to getting like processed fast food alternatives to meat, or you're just eating like ramen noodles over and over and over again, or mac and cheese over and over and over again, and you're not eating meat, but you're also not being healthy. Versus if you were conscious about your meat intake and the negative impacts it could have on your health, and then balance that within a healthy omnivorous diet, or a balanced omnivorous diet, that would actually be more healthy than strict vegetarianism because of the balance. So given your individual situation, it is going to make a different amount of sense to do different things to create a healthy lifestyle for yourself. And so that's where I come to with that one. A virtuous person would be persuaded to at least examine their relationship to meat, examine their relationship to all 5 of those arguments, but they might not be persuaded to become a vegetarian.